ITIL Release Management. Well, as we saw in the previous nugget, change is inevitable, and as change occurs more frequently and more rapidly in our ever-growing organic environments, whether it be a business or an organization, we need to have a way to manage and track the implementation of hardware and software releases. Now, we looked at RFCs in the previous nugget, and a release is going to be defined by the RFC that it implements. So release management, as we're going to see here, is really kind of a planned project approach to implementing changes in our IT services. Release management has a goal to make sure we have quality of our production environment, hardware and software, with formal technical procedures and integrity checks when we implement new versions. Especially when we're dealing with large projects, release management is critical. The costs that are incurred by not putting in place release management means huge interruptions to poorly planned software releases and hardware upgrades. The duplication of tasks because you've got copies of different versions throughout your organization. It's also an inefficient use of resources because you cannot track where the resources are going. You can lose source files and other associated files. Also, it's very difficult to apply security and virus protection to your systems if you aren't sure what versions of operating systems, applications, services, and device drivers are being used. With that being said, let's dive into release management. In this nugget on release management, we're going to conquer 4 key topics. First of all, we'll look at the basics of release management. Then we'll look at the goals of the release management process in this IT service. Then we'll look at the 3 major release types. And finally, the release management processes and activities. I want to start out looking at the basics, the fundamentals of release management. And as you're looking at this slide here, you notice over there on the left, upper left-hand corner, I've got a picture of a big hoagie, a giant Subway sandwich with ketchup and mustard, and you might be wondering, what does that have to do with release management? Nothing, okay? It's just almost lunchtime and I'm really hungry, so I just put that picture up there. It really helps me out. But that being said, a release basically is made up of one or more authorized changes. I could write that down, but it's pretty simple. It's also in your glossary as well. But then we want to talk about the different types of releases or authorized changes that we have. First of all, we have what's called the major release. This is a major rollout representing a substantial increase in the overall functionality of the system or the hardware. One of the main goals is to eliminate errors and, of course, add functionality. One of the most typical ways to think of a release would be, let's say, Linux Red Hat version 6.0 going to Red Hat version 7.0, or maybe the Mac OS going to a new version. Windows NT 4.0 to Windows NT 5.0, which became, of course, Windows 2000. At the time of the production of this particular nugget movie, we're looking at Microsoft Vista being a major release. We've also got major releases in applications, in versions of services. For example, we could consider IP addressing version 6 or IPv6 as a major release of the Internet Protocol. For example, I'm just making up this program, but if we have, let's say, a sales tracking program, a major release would be version 1, version 2, version 3, etc. Now, we can use versioning numbers, or we can simply assign aliases. For example, Microsoft Vista is an alias for a numbered major release. For our purposes, though, we want to stick to numbering schemes. Now, a minor software release would be minor enhancements to the software. Basic functionality enhancement, maybe some slight changes to the interface, or you have to fix problems, security holes, compatibility errors, support for newer hardware that's out there. For example, with my SalesTrack application, I might have version 1.1. or version 2.2 or version 3.5, etc. Now, remember, you can even go more granular than that. You may have, for example, a version 3.5.1. Okay, or maybe you can put 5A or 5B. It just depends on what type of scheme you're going to use. If you're going to have a lot of minor enhancements, a lot of minor upgrades, then you might want to break it down and get a more granular versioning scheme. This version numbering scheme can become very elaborate depending upon the release, the minor release, any types of service packs that are added. So for example, if you go to Help on the menu of Internet Explorer, for example, and choose About Internet Explorer, it will show you what version is being used here. You can see how elaborate this is, 6.0.2900.2180.xpsp.sp2, GDR, and then more numbers. So this can get very elaborate. The same thing goes for Mozilla Firefox. If I go to Help and choose About Mozilla Firefox, I can see the same type of elaborate versioning information as well. It all depends upon the vendor, what type of scheme that's going to be used. The bottom line is it has to be uniform, widely accepted, and understandable. For most applications and for most operating systems, using a major and minor release number will be adequate. You've also got hardware upgrades, which may or may not have their own versioning number, but they'll definitely have some type of numbering scheme, some type of unique identifier. And this is to improve support for the hardware and functionality of the hardware. Now, in addition to major releases and minor releases and hardware releases, you'll also have what are called emergency fixes. And these emergency fixes themselves will typically have their own numbering scheme. Another term that you'll see in your glossary, your ITIL version 3 glossary, is what's called a release unit. Okay, this is the aspect or the piece of the IT infrastructure that normally gets released together for the purposes of control and efficiency as you make changes. For example, operating systems would be a release unit. Network appliances would be a release unit. Okay, so these are typically changes made at a system level, an entire suite, let's say like Microsoft Office, that would be a release unit. Okay, or the program, or even what we call a modular level. Another example of a release unit is a DLL, or a dynamic link library that's commonly used in the Windows environment, and applications use these DLLs to provide their functionality and interface with hardware and the operating system itself. When a new DLL version is released, it's provided within a package. And that package itself will be tested, retested, reinstalled before it's released. Now there are several different release types, and I want to talk about those. But before we do these release types, let me give you the goals, the overall goals of release management. You know, release management is of special interest to me because of the last several years as I've worked with State Farm and IBM, I've been actively participating in the release management process, whether it be upgrading hardware, adding hardware, replacing, reconfiguring, and upgrading Cisco routers, as well as workstations and server operating systems. So I'm very familiar with the goals of release management. Let me share this with you. First of all, with release management, we want to get a holistic view of the IT service change process. The way we get this holistic view is by getting our hands dirty. Okay? It's a real hands-on approach to change. As a member of the Release Management Working Group, you're going to make sure that technical and non-technical aspects are considered. We understand technical aspects. Okay, that's the actual code or the software or the hardware or the service change. But the non-technical aspects are things like what are the effect on the end user? What are the logistics of rolling the product out or upgrading the hardware? It could even be negotiating with vendors. For example, when we get new laptops for State Farm, are we going to go with Dell? Or are we going to go with HP? Why not IBM, as we have in the past? Well, IBM's getting out of the laptop business, so we're going to replace those IBM ThinkPads with some new vendor. Those are the non-technical aspects. Release management is a hands-on working group. So this is one of those areas that's really particular. You are in a working group. And if you look at open standard protocols, and new technologies out there like wireless technology, for example. These are all driven by working groups that look at the technical and non-technical aspects. These working groups are going to manage the planning of the release, the overall policy, and how it's rolled out, typically over the World Wide Web, the design of the release, the builds, and the overall configuration, and the configuration updates. The working group may actually be part of an overall campaign for acceptance. Realize that a lot of working groups are put together for releases that never get accepted, never become standardized. Therefore, they aren't accepted. So sometimes this is a real campaigning process. They're going to plan once it's accepted. Once it reaches a certain status, they will actually plan the eventual rollout of this release. Of course, release management is going to conduct extensive pilot testing, testing and retesting, basically pre-test, pilot test, and post-testing. Post-testing can be referred to as auditing, okay? The auditing of hardware and software during and following the change implementation. Release management is hands-on involved in the preparation, in the installation, and possibly the training for implementing this particular release. Release management's about storage of the software, releasing the software, distributing the software, and ultimately installing the software or hardware solution. Those are the goals of release management. Now, as I've mentioned, every release, regardless of how large it is or what type of release it is, has to be uniquely identified, and I've given you a couple of examples of unique identifiers, some very elaborate. Well, we also need to define some type of scheme within the policy, the release policy, and make sure that it's followed. Now, that being said, there are 3 types of releases that you'll need to understand for the ITIL Foundation's exam. First of all, you've got a full release, and a full release is going to test, distribute, and implement all of the components of that release unit. Let's say, for example, an operating system upgrade or a new iOS for a Cisco router, whether or not they've changed since the last release of the software. Very important differentiation. A Delta release does not replace all the component change information or change instances within a release unit, but it's only going to include those change instances that have changed since the last release of the software. This is also known as a partial release. Similar to kind of how we approach doing database backups, where you've got a full backup and then you've got a partial backup, for example. Then what we have, third type, is a package. And the package includes a set of 2 or more full releases and is thoroughly tested and introduced into a live environment as a single release. The classic example of a package is Microsoft Office. Microsoft Office is made up of full releases. Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Access, Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Outlook. So again, to reiterate, a full release is all the components of the release unit being built, tested, and distributed entirely, including components that were not changed. A Delta or partial release only includes changed hardware and software components. This could even be an emergency fix or a temporary fix. And a package release is a bundle of full and or Delta releases of related applications and infrastructure that are typically released over longer time intervals. And again, Microsoft Office is a sweet, perfect example of what a package release would be. This is a nice diagram courtesy of the ITSMF, and I'm going to use this to basically explain this release management process. Also, we're going to look at its relationship with other IT services, and then of course we'll break down what's happening here in this release management as this is kind of our list of activities or actions. First of all, this is all basically driven by service level management based on the agreements that you have from your IT services with other entities. agreements about available software and available hardware. Then we can see here the relationship as it works with change management, and I mentioned this earlier. Release management and change management are tightly coupled, and your manager may be in charge of both of these services. Here are the change management actions that we talked about in the previous Nugget movie: recording, accepting, classifying, planning, building and testing, implementing and evaluating. Release management is driven by changes. Now down here below that, we have what's called configuration management. Notice there's no text with that because we're going to cover configuration management in the next ITIL Nugget movie. Now, what is also generated from this release management process here are several different databases. You have a DSL, and this is not DSL that you get for high-speed internet in your home, okay? This is the Definitive Software Library. The Definitive Software Library, DSL, is a term you need to know. It's a secure repository that stores the definitive, authorized versions or the masters of all the software instances. Think of this as the master tapes for an album or a CD, for example. The DSL may be distributed across many locations in a number of secure media vaults and fireproof safes. Now, notice along with that, we have what's called DML. DML is the Definitive Media Library. Okay, DML is really an ITIL version 3 specific term. Okay. On your test, you may see either one of these terms, but the version 3 term is DML, okay? The Definitive Media Library represents the locations where the definitive and approved versions of all software instances or configuration items, CIs, are securely stored. This may also include licenses and documentation. Down here, we have the DHS, okay? And we're talking about hardware too. So DHS is the Definitive Hardware Store. The Definitive Hardware Store is going to have your stocks of hardware and spare parts, spare power supplies, spare modules, spare network appliances, spare workstations, laptops, the list goes on. Now, also working along with the DSL, DML, and the DHS is the Configuration Management Database. I've already referred to the CMDB earlier, but this is where we check information about our configuration items or instances. In any software versions or hardware versions that are incorporated into the DSL, DML, or DHS, we'll also have details updated in the Configuration Management Database as well. Let's look over here at Release Management and look at the processes or activities of release management. First of all, we can see here a whole string of actions: policy and planning, then design, building and configuration, and then testing and release acceptance, rollout planning, communication, preparation and training, and then finally, release distribution and installation. Now, one thing that makes this easier is you can break this down into 3 different environments. So as a release manager, you could have 3 separate teams or 3 separate committees or working groups that are helping on this process. For example, the development environment would be made up of policy and planning. And then you have what we call the controlled test environment. The controlled test environment, let me jot that down. So the second environment here is the controlled test environment. This is the design, building, and configuration, the testing and release acceptance, the rollout planning, the communication to other entities, preparation and training. And then finally you have what's called the live environment. And the live environment is the release distribution and final installation. Now, before we move on and talk about each one of these environments in detail, I want you to make sure that you understand this diagram and that you can see the synergy here. All of this is driven by service level management, okay, based on our agreements. And then you've got change management, release management, and configuration management working in concert. And then, of course, that's going to generate stores, okay, hardware stores, definitive software stores or DSL libraries, and DMLs, definitive media libraries, and then information about all of these stores is going to be inputted into a database called the Configuration Management Database. The first environment is the release management development environment. Again, this is going to include release policy. The release manager needs to develop a release policy along with steering committees, maybe a corporate liaison from management to find out and define how and when the releases are going to be configured. This is when you're going to have your planning of major releases with the release identification or version numbers. This process is known as release identification. You'll also determine during the release planning process what level the configuration item can be independently distributed of each other, these release units. Do they need to be released as a package, or can they be released independently? You have to evaluate during the planning and design and development the potential impact of the release, how many man or person hours it's going to take, the life cycle of the process, how difficult the installation on the production side and the impact on the end user. Also the complexity of dependencies between software and other software, software and hardware, and the overall IT infrastructure. You'll also develop standard procedures for designing, building, and configuring your releases during this RM development environment. Again, you're going to either design or develop the software, or you'll actually purchase the software. Notice I didn't put purchased or design and develop hardware. It is possible, I guess, in rare occasions that the organization's actually designing and developing the hardware solution as well as implementing it. But more often than not, you're going to be designing your own software and implementing it, or purchasing the software and purchasing the hardware. These are all the things that happen in the development environment. In the release management control test environment, you're going to want to put together a pilot testing environment or a pilot testing lab to set up and test at least a prototypical hardware and or software solution before you actually configure and install. Also, along with this, you want to have what's called a backout plan. ITIL version 3 refers to this as remediation, or the ability to recover to a known state after a failed change or a failed release. You want to have a backout plan in place. And even though change management is really responsible for making sure that you have a backout plan created, release management should be a part of the process to help make sure that these plans are actually practical. Because remember, release management is the hands-on aspect, where change management is really more logical, more design. Now, along with this build and configure process with the backout plan, you want to have what's called a fit-for-purpose test. Fit for purpose is kind of an informal term that's used to describe either a process or a CI configuration item or an IT service that allows you to meet objectives or service levels. Once you successfully conduct a fit-for-purpose test, you're basically saying, look, we've got a suitable design, implementation, control, and maintenance in place. Remember, the most common cause of unsatisfactory changes and underwhelming releases is an inadequate testing process. So before release, you should have a functional test by all representatives of the users and an operational test by IT administrators, IT engineers, anybody in IT who has technical expertise in these areas. Operational, functional, performance, integration expertise. So the bottom line is this: a release is going to be accepted not in production, but it's going to be accepted in the controlled test environment. And that's a key differentiation. Think about if you're buying or selling a house, okay? The two parties are going to agree upon a contract and sign off on it. They're going to accept it, and then there's a period of time, often an option period of 10 days, and maybe extra time for the process to get hashed out. Financing, the funding, the inspections, the appraisals, the back and forth between the two parties. So again, acceptance comes before deployment. And then, of course, you have next the actual rollout planning. The release plan that you drew up during these preceding stages is now going to be supplemented with additional information. Okay, this is going to be the exact implementation activities and the exact schedule. This is when you're going to bring in people like project managers, people with a PMP certification. Now, there's two ways to implement a rollout. Okay. Basically, you've got what's called the Big Bang approach. I'll just put Big Bang. The Big Bang approach is basically rolled out in full, or you can roll out in stages. Remember this. Two options, Big Bang or rolled out in stages. And again, it's the project managers typically who are responsible for organizing and managing that aspect of it. And then of course, finally, the final step of the release management controlled test environment is communication to all parties. Communication with customers, for example, the service desk, customer relations management, any operational personnel, any representatives of the user organization. All these people need to be made aware of the planned rollout. Also, preparation. This is the preparation. This is basically being in the on-deck circle, okay? You're in the on-deck circle and you're preparing and you're getting ready to roll this thing out. And then, of course, training. Training is a very vital aspect of this. So you're going to be working with other IT services that deliver training to end users, customers, vendors, and the like. This could be just simply having awareness training published to a website and making that available, all the way down to actual training modules that you develop, for example, like a CBT Nugget. You could have a custom CBT Nugget solution for this particular software or hardware. Depends on your organization. From our diagram, the third release management environment is the live environment, and it speaks for itself, okay? This is where you actually distribute the release, monitoring the logistical process for the purchasing of the product, the software, the hardware, if that's applicable, the storage, transport, delivery, actual handover of the software and hardware. You're going to support this distribution with procedures, with logs, with documentation. It could be things like packing slips. This distribution of software and hardware includes audit trails and a chain of custody, often used in law enforcement or security, to make sure that this software and hardware, as it passes through different hands, you're documenting and holding people accountable for having this in their possession. Of course, the storage of hardware and software should be secure and only accessible by authorized personnel. And of course, you've got the installation process, and this, of course, is self-explanatory. Installing the software, the package, the device driver, installing the hardware solution. And this could be a number of different components. But you also want to make sure that when you're doing this, that software is one thing. You know, it's compatibility with other applications, the operating system compatibility, all those things. But when it comes to hardware, do you have the right conditions, the right environment, sufficient disk space, security, environmental controls? Are there floor space limitations, power, underworld power supply, UPS, air conditioning, all these things as far as hardware goes? That's really beyond the scope of this ITIL, but keep those things in mind. There's a lot of factors here. Finally, I want to look here at some costs and potential pitfalls with release management. The final aspects of the release management process or activities to consider are the cost and the pitfalls of release management. First of all, the costs are going to be in personnel. That's all the members of the release management working group and other interested parties. The storage for the DSL, DML, and DHS, the software, media, and hardware storage. That also includes costs for backup and recovery or redundant systems as well. There's the cost of building and testing environments and distribution environments. All of those things have costs associated with them that need to be taken into consideration. There's, of course, if you're purchasing the software from a vendor, third-party software, the cost of the software and the licensing. If it's hardware you're purchasing, which you usually are, the cost of the hardware as well as the installation. Typically, the cost for installing hardware is greater than the cost for installing software. The pitfalls and the challenges of release management are the fact that you may run into resistance from parties, people that are used to a certain software platform or a certain operating system or a certain graphical user interface or types of hardware, resistance from users, resistance from management. Part of the release management working group's job is to campaign to overcome that resistance. Also, another pitfall with release management is the same thing as incident management, and that is the vulnerabilities of circumventing the release management process, where you have individual users, for example, updating their software upgrading their software on their own without going through the change management, release management process, replacing hardware. For example, bringing in a new all-in-one printer to replace a scanner and a standalone printer when it's an unauthorized hardware installation. Those types of things. Happens all the time. Also, another pitfall is when the distribution process itself is out of sync. For example, one business unit or one area releases the software or hardware weeks or months in advance of another business unit that can cause political problems, morale problems, personnel problems. And of course, the biggest pitfall of all is simply inadequate testing. You cannot test enough. You cannot create a too perfect prototypical environment to test out your hardware or your software release. In this nugget of the ITIL series, we covered 4 aspects of release management: the basics of release management, the goals of release management, the release types, and then release management processes and activities. I hope this CBT Nugget's been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. See you in the next movie.